Well, from what I understand, our guest hears this often, but we are chatting with someone who is probably the furthest away from me possible, with the exception of one other we did in Australia. We are in New Zealand chatting with Tom Barrasso. He is the founder and developer of PodLP. And I don't think I'm going to do it justice by explaining it, but he basically has created software that helps bring podcasts to non-smartphones around the world. And probably most of the listeners don't know how many are out there, but I'm sure we're going to get some really good information about that. Tom, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So were you in the podcasting space? Like, did you have interest in podcasting before PodLP? Like, what kind of led you to want to develop this software?
Yeah, basically the story starts with the pandemic. Like a lot of people, I no longer had a commute. I had a lot less to do, a lot more time on my hands. And I'd been getting into this idea of, as a lot of people are, and we'll talk about the types of users that are drawn to feature phones. But I wanted one basically for digital detox purposes. I wanted to take it camping for weekend trips. And the issue that I had, my girlfriend made fun of me at the time. She was like, "You'll never be able to do that because they don't have a podcast app." And because as a developer, I was like, okay, great, challenge accepted. I'll go ahead and build one. It can't be that hard. So that was more or less when I got started. The big issue for me then, for folks who are probably aware of the timeline, was the podcast index hadn't yet launched. And so probably the hardest thing as a developer back then was just getting the feeds together, figuring out how to build a directory. That was definitely the biggest challenge to overcome. And then I launched pretty quickly. I think it took me under a month to actually get it shipped. Although granted, I'll say the very first version of PodLP was about as unglamorous as you can get. It didn't even have thumbnails because I couldn't figure out how to shrink the images to fit the screen without running into memory issues. So there were a lot of issues trying to wrangle the world of podcasting to fit feature phones.
Interesting. I'm surprised you say that it's hard to get information on podcasts because, everybody classically, when somebody signs up, you say, all right, you sign up for Apple, and then you'll find yourself on, a few dozen other platforms who basically go into their directory. Is Apple's API difficult, expensive? Like what made getting the content from Apple more difficult than waiting for Podcast Index to come along and, provide this great resource?
Yeah, so at the time, I think one of the biggest challenges with the Apple dataset was, or the Apple APIs were, they're obviously not geared towards this type of user segment, and there are a lot of criteria that mandated the need for an API that was specific to this market segment. I'll give you a couple of examples. I gave the one of thumbnails first off. So that's something Apple actually does pretty well, but you can run into restrictions. I know people say like the Apple API is rate limited. When we go into talking about the version of PodLP that runs in CloudPhone, I'll talk about why that was a concern. But perhaps one of the bigger ones was for PodLP specifically, especially launching in India, it needed to support IPv6 only use. Something that podcasters probably don't think about. Basically, there's two versions of the internet protocol. In the good old days, you had IP addresses IPv4. It basically had four numerical segments between 0 to 255. So a number like 192.168.0.1. There were, I think, 4 billion, give or take, IPv4 addresses, which is a problem because there's more than 4 billion people, not excluding all of the devices that we all have today. So you can imagine that eventually hit a limit. And IPv6 solves that. It has far more IPv addresses. The addresses themselves are far more complicated. And something I get from a lot of podcasters is, well, why should we care about this, right? Because in Western markets, the telecommunication operators will handle backwards compatibility with technologies like NAT64 and DNS64. They basically make it so that IPv4 devices connect to IPv6 services and vice versa. In emerging markets like India, they don't do that. It's just too expensive. It's not worth their time. And so podcasters don't know what they're missing out on. And importantly, the user doesn't know because they don't, the user gets an ambiguous error, and the podcast hosting company never finds out because the user is never able to reach their service. So there's no error for them. They can't see how much potential they're missing here. So I basically had to have an API that was able to account for things like this and allow me to suppress certain feeds based on the host that they were on. And had I relied solely on Apple, I wouldn't have had the ability to do things like that.
Gotcha. All right. So they come along, make it a little bit easier, and therefore PodLP is born. I think for some folks, I don't think they understand how big the feature phone market is, and I guess another way people think of feature phones are dumb phones, right? Not big, tall screen phones like an Android or an Apple device. What are we looking at? How many are out there? Where are they popular? Yeah, how big is this market still?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you heard me mention India. The market for feature phones is still quite large. It's stable in countries like the United States, where it has resisted declining, probably because of a combination of factors. So right now, the PodLP market specifically, India makes up the lion's share of use, probably about 80%, give or take. The United States is actually the second largest market for feature phones worldwide. I think last year, almost 3 million units were sold across the United States. So that's one that surprises a lot of people.
Who's buying them?
Yeah, who's buying them? That's a great question. I see probably three primary markets here. One are seniors. A lot of these devices are geared towards older folks. The second are children, parents buying them for their kids that they want to have restricted use. And it's a lot easier to restrict a feature phone that only has, say, 100 apps than it is to restrict an iPhone with 3 million apps potentially. And then the third is digital detoxers, Gen Z, millennials, people who are trying to get away from scrolling addiction. And probably the easiest way that they've found to accomplish that is to remove the temptation by moving to feature phones.
Interesting. All right, so you those three populations in the U.S., India. So it sounds like a lot of emerging markets and a lot of underdeveloped countries where maybe the networks aren't as strong, but obviously they still want and need reliable communication. Um, I guess for a lot of podcasters, we probably don't think a lot about them, especially ones based here in the U.S. Uh, do you see them being like a burgeoning podcast consumption market and one that more people should be paying attention to?
Oh, absolutely. I think probably the single biggest reason why you should pay attention to markets, especially ones like India, is that India is the largest English-speaking country if you take into account English as a second language. So, there's over 400 million English speakers in India, well more than those in the United States. And then it's just a very fast-growing market. Many people are coming online at a much faster pace than in other parts of the world. If you think about the digital divide, for those who have access to mobile connectivity, you still have about 2.5 to 3 billion people around the world who do not have access to any type of mobile internet connection. That includes basic 2G, like if you were going to do SMS or calling, like you'd get on a really basic feature phone. There's a huge, huge potential in these markets. And audio has a really strong potential because it overcomes a lot of the linguistic barriers that you would get in a country like India, where if you exclude English, it's a very fragmented market where you have more than a dozen regional Indic languages that all sort of compete for pretty large sizes of population, right? There are languages in India that have more than 100 million speakers that I bet you most people have never heard of before. And audio is just a much easier format to distribute that information in because it's easier for the user to consume. It's more familiar. A lot of them are familiar with radio today. So it's something that they're cognitively easier to adapt to.
So what's the feature phone version of a podcast store like? What's the experience like on PodLP? Are there, limitations that smartphone podcast consumers would visit, or is it really just you were able to shrink all that UX and UI into that smaller screen typically?
Yeah, you can shrink quite a bit. PodLP is a long way from when it first launched. There's definitely thumbnails now, rich search, categorization for podcasts, feeds that are adapted based on a number of indicators, including geography and language. But beyond that, it's got a lot of the basic features you would expect. So if you were to open PodLP today, it'll take you to the homepage. You'll see a set of podcasts that include sponsored content. So that's how PodLP is able to sustain its operations, as well as organic content that is ranked based on, as I mentioned, language, geography, and a few other factors. And then you would click into a podcast. It would look like you would expect today. You have the ability to subscribe. You can change the sort order. You can download individual episodes on the KaiOS version. On CloudPhone, that's not possible, and I can talk a little bit about why that's not possible technologically. And then, you can play, you can scrub through a podcast, you can do seeking. There's a sleep timer functionality. So a lot of the things that you might expect are there, But I'll say probably the biggest thing that isn't there would be automatic downloads. The platforms today don't have that capability, and that's something that probably shocks a lot of people in the podcasting world. Certainly shocks subscribers to PodLP, because if you think about it, if you have an iPhone or an Android today, when you click subscribe, you're so used to having that episode ready there for you. But what that also means is that when a user clicks subscribe, your download numbers are pretty tightly correlated to the number of subscribers that you have. It doesn't mean that, and the problem that I'm sure everyone in the podcasting world knows, listens are not downloads. That is the exact opposite in the feature phone market. Without the ability to do automatic downloads, every download that you get from an app like PodLP is an organic listen that is triggered by a direct user action.
Right. So it's down. Not all downloads are listens, but all listens are downloads, right? Because there are some services that, list their stats differently, and it's, for a lot of people it gets very confusing. So because you have access to the podcast index, should folks hearing this who are like, oh, that is a big market and my content would actually make a lot of sense there, do they have to get themselves onto PodLP, or are you already kind of grabbing those feeds from the big directories?
Yeah, not anymore. Since the migration roughly a year ago now, PodLP is using the podcast index for its backend, so there's no need to submit your feed directly. I think there's an old landing page for that, but it basically is just grayed out and says there's nothing that you need to do here. But if you're excluding your feed from the podcast index, then it's very likely it won't get picked up by PodLP, and there currently isn't really a way to manually override that.
What would downloads on PodLP look like in my stats on standard hosting platforms?
The short answer is it really depends on what host you're using. From the very beginning, I've had hosts that were very proactive. For instance, Buzzsprout, I think they added support for the PodLP user agent fragment back in probably 2020, not long after it launched. Many hosts have been reluctant since then. So if you're looking at PodLP downloads today, you're going to see probably, I could think of at least 5 or 6 different things. So it comes from, and it stems from the 2 platforms that PodLP is currently supporting, KaiOS and CloudPhone. KaiOS is a mobile operating system based on Firefox OS. So if you get downloads from PodLP and your host doesn't support the user agent, it's probably going to look like either Firefox, browser, Linux, or occasionally Android, because some KaiOS devices will put Android in the user agent fragment to force websites into a mobile view. So it's sort of a workaround that ends up misattributing downloads. And then if you're on CloudPhone, it's a little bit different. It's going to look like browser, Google Chrome, or Linux. And that's because the CloudPhone user agent, CloudPhone is a remote browser, basically like Opera Mini, but it runs using the Chromium engine. And so, hosts will misattribute PodLP downloads pretty much all over the place. And CloudPhone's even more difficult because they use, like Opera Mini, they have a fleet of servers that does transcoding on the fly to be able to serve content to these types of budget devices. And so the IP address ranges that you're going to be seeing traffic from is much narrower on CloudPhone as well.
Gotcha. So I have to ask, are you a primarily feature phone person, or are you on smartphones and you're just making sure podcasts are accessible to everyone?
I'm on the smartphone for a variety of reasons. But it's obviously they're quite difficult to use. There's a number of services that I unfortunately need on a bit more regular basis. And these devices, because they're so budget, tend to have a narrower frequency band. And because I'm traveling in places like New Zealand, it just gets quite difficult to be able to have a phone that actually works in multiple countries. You end up sort of buying a new phone everywhere you go. Although I do have a very extensive collection of these phones. I probably have, 15, 20 of them at this point.
That's great. Yeah, I just wrapped up watching a series that was, supposed to take place like late 90s, early 2000s, and everybody in the show is using a flip phone. And I'm watching that going, I don't want to get rid of my iPhone, right? It is powerful. It is important. It does a lot of things. But sometimes I want to leave that at home and just carry a flip phone for people to call me on. I think that would be so awesome. So we have been chatting with Tom Barrasso, founder and developer of PodLP. You can take a look at what they're up to at podlp.com. Tom, before we let you go, some other questions we want to ask you about, podcasting in general. The first is, you have solved a problem for folks who who do not have access to smartphones and bringing podcasts to them. Are there other places in podcasting where you would like to see improvement, or you're thinking about, maybe solving problems for us?
Yeah, I actually submitted a couple of recommendations to the Podcast Index when they were coming up with their the namespace, the RSS namespace. Unfortunately, I don't think they got widely adopted. Alternate enclosures was a big one. I know that podcasters like to record in the highest quality possible, and it makes sense for the types of markets when you're prioritizing, say, Apple. But obviously, for accessibility, it's just a waste. People streaming high bitrate podcasts on a 4G feature phone that outputs to a really grainy speaker are not benefiting from that quality. If anything, they're just wasting their data on it. So I think that was one. Similarly with thumbnails, like I mentioned, it was always unfortunate to me that because we always focus in the largest possible device categories, most podcast artwork is 2,000, 3,000 pixels in size. That is 10 times the size of the screen that these things render on. And so it's just wasting pixels here. In fact, I've had many people, when they come to do a sponsor on PodLP, they ask, what does it look like? And they see the scaled down version at 128 pixels and like, what? I can't read any of that. I'm like, yeah, that's the point. You can't read it because you couldn't, how could you possibly read on a half an inch, a quarter of an inch of screen real estate? So yeah, I think just getting people aware, I think that's the biggest thing, being aware that there's millions of people who would like to consume this content and finding ways to make it more accessible technically, finding ways to make it more accessible in terms of the places that you distribute on, the devices that you consider, and the markets that you target.
All right. Have you ever hosted a podcast, or do you just like supporting it with software?
I haven't hosted. It's something I've definitely thought about. I've always heard the advice from folks that if you're gonna, start a podcast, it has to be something that you really love, because especially in the beginning, it's not a good business. If anything, it's probably more of an expense. So yeah, I think I'm just waiting for that idea to come around. But I've always wondered, because I have this platform, right? Like I have a place that I can promote my own material that I don't have to pay for. So it's certainly something that's crossed my mind.
Yeah, I mean, with your level of technical expertise on podcasts, on coding, I'm sure you can provide a lot of value to folks who want to have a deeper understanding of what's going on, and honestly, not just where we are, but where we could be going, especially with a lot of the RSS 2.0 stuff. So I want to ask you about tech on your wish list, because usually people say like a microphone or whatnot, and you've already brought tech to the table for us. So I'll ask you this instead. What podcasts are you listening to these days that are your favorites? The kind that, whenever a new episode comes along, you are going to stop and go over there, or you are not going to miss an episode of that show. Are there, a few that are just, always on your, regular playlist?
Oh yeah, and you can tell this probably from my website. They'll usually be the ones that I'm featuring inadvertently in screenshots and other promotional material. So yeah, I listen a lot to Planet Money from NPR. And How I Built This. Yeah, just the inspiration of some of these stories, hearing other creators and how they were able to successfully come up with ideas, build, scale, and just the challenges that they faced. Like for me, going through PodLP, I found a lot of curveballs. There's like legal challenges to operating in the Indian market. There's technical ones, like I mentioned, with IPv6. There's a lot of things that you just wouldn't think about if your sole focus is the Western world. And so yeah, it sort of forced me to reconsider that view and expand my technical horizons.
Gotcha. Well, once again, we have been chatting with Tom Barrasso, founder, developer of PodLP. You don't have to go over there to submit your show, but you should check it out and find your show's link and start to put that on your website next to your other buttons, and show that you are thinking about folks who don't necessarily have a smartphone. I think that would be a really, it's interesting to see. It would be interesting to see more of those popping up in the coming days and years and whatnot. Well, Tom, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.